My name is Emmanuel Wachendo. I will be moderating this webinar. Today's topic is reforming Kenya's petroleum pricing policy. What options? So, first of all, the Institute of Economic Affairs is a think tank whose job is to validate or invalidate public policy. We do this through 5 different programs: public finance management, international trade and development, regulation and competition policy, uh, popular economics, and public finance management, and futures and foresights. So these programs were designed to respond to what we believe are the major policy areas that we chose as priorities because of their importance in in understanding the state of Kenya's economic welfare. And in these specific domains, we regularly propose ideas and also challenge public policy where we see that it is ill-fitted. Ill-fitted in what sense? Ill-fitted in terms of building a flourishing society whose economy is well managed. Today's presenters are Fiona Okadia, Kwame Owino, and Vivian Ochola. So the topic is, what options does Kenya have to reform its petroleum pricing policy? What we hope you understand by the end of this is that the Kenyan oil, the petroleum market is structured in a certain way. We want you to understand the government's role within that structure. We want you to understand what the fuel pricing mechanism is within that structure, to understand why the government makes announcements every month about where fuel prices will sit, why this is not a conventional or an ideal or a necessary arrangement of the market, what the different ways this market could be arranged. And this is important because fuel is a commodity that touches so many facets of our economic life, both as Kenyans, but also as human beings. It is a commodity that defines the human civilization. So in response to this very critical matter that has been made even more important by the recent events, the Strait of Hormuz, we tackle this question: what reform options are there for Kenya's petroleum pricing policy? Please take it away.
So this will be our outline. So we'll first discuss why fuel matters, and then go into the fuel pricing structure. And then Vivian will come in and speak to us on why is Kenya having the fuel shock. And then when we come to the different Kenya's fuel options that we have, we'll discuss a couple of them. So myself, Vivian, and Kwame, and then we'll conclude and we'll open it up to questions and answers. So why does fuel matter? So first of all, when we look at Kenya's energy supply mix, which in 2025, according to the economic survey that was released this year, it stands at about 17.4 million terajoules. But then now when you look at petroleum products, so that's kerosene, diesel, heavy fuel oil, they take up less than 1% of the total energy mix. Now, that sounds a bit surprising, because if you listen to the public debate in Kenya right now, you would often think that Kenya is like fuel is actually the single most important energy source in the country, but it isn't. So you look at a product such as biomass. So this is your firewood and your charcoal. It takes about almost 50%, because it's about 800,000 about in terms of supply. But now you don't see anyone marching in the streets because charcoal prices went up, or you don't see the government issuing a press statement just to try and calm everyone down. And so one may wonder, then why is this the case? So if you look at Kenya's energy structure, it's still very pre-industrial because a huge portion of our households are the ones that are relying on traditional biomass for either cooking or heating up stuff. And that's very different from the economies that we consider highly industrialized, where they use quite a lot of electricity, a lot of gas, and actually also petroleum. But not to say that petroleum is not important, it is, because in as much as it's a very small percentage, you look at it in terms of it's the one that's driving the modern economy. So think about transport in Kenya, for instance. It's overwhelmingly run on petroleum. I know that there are some, especially for Uber drivers who use gases, and there are some electric vehicles, but it's not a huge percentage of what runs the transport industry when you look at the petroleum sector. So the impact of petroleum is then that just gives us to show that it's really important even in the country. And then, of course, it has also ripple effects across the economy. So, for instance, if transport goes up today, that means that food will become expensive because, like, you look at Nairobi, a lot of the food that you consume comes from the rural areas. So, as far as western sides, Kisii sides. So by the time you transport the food to Nairobi, they have to factor in those costs. There are other costs, but they have to factor in transport costs. And then now the price of food again will be translated to inflation. And so when you have rising petroleum prices, you have rising food prices, all of this combined will lead to an increase in inflation. And I think you can also see that because last week on Friday, there was a release of the consumer price index, and now inflation has risen from 5.6% to 6.7%, which is largely just being driven by transport because they segregate the components, not all the 330 items, but they have a few that they list, and you can see something like diesel, which has increased by 25% in just 1 month. So even if someone never owned a car in their life, they will still feel that fuel inflation because it means your matatu price has gone up, unga prices go up, and then there's the electricity again that has gone up. Prices in the shops have gone up. So this is why fuel matters. And then, of course, there's the element of political stability, and this is not unique to Kenya. We've had protests around the world. So, for instance, France, where the Yellow Vest movement, where largely was because of fuel price frustrations. You had Nigeria some time back go to the streets because government had decided to remove fuel subsidies. So and all of that. So energy fuel prices can be able to even destabilize governments because we can see how fuel affects daily life so directly. So before we begin discussing the fuel pricing structure, I think it's important to just note, for those of us who don't know, that retail petroleum prices are announced every 14th of every month, and then they will go, so those prices would be effective 15th until the 14th of the following month. So if they were announced today, in June 14th, they will take effect 15th June to 14th of July. Now, the first thing that I need us to understand is the landed cost. So that we go beyond the whole global prices have gone up or they've gone down, because the actual calculation of petroleum is layered. So it has a lot of financial and also logistic processes that involve shipping, they involve banking, they involve insurance, storage, and all of that. So if you had a look at the May to June cycle, we can see that the landed cost for something like super petrol was 117 shillings. So the very first component that we usually take into consideration is what you call the free on board price. So this basically is the price in the international markets before you ship it. So you can look at it as the base price. And then to that, the importers of these petroleum goods will then add freight and premium costs. So this adjusts the expenses that go into transporting the fuel from the source country. So if you're getting it from where? From Nigeria, for instance, that's your source country, and it's coming to Kenya. Then there's usually a very important element that's called a letter of credit. So it's commonly known as the LC. Now, here is interesting because it shows how fuel importation is tied to the banking system. So, as you know, oil cargoes are very expensive, and most of the time, the marketing companies don't have this money upfront, and they don't pay it upfront. So, what they do is they go to the bank. The bank guarantees payment through a letter of credit. And remember, this letter of credit is almost like some sort of loan. So it's not like they're just telling you, okay, you're my friend, we'll pay it. No, there's a charge to it, which is about 1.2%. So that has to, of course, be transferred to the prices. Now, in the old tender system, the oil marketers were allowed to pay back this money after 30 days. But I think last year or maybe now 2 years, because time is really rushing, we had a webinar, and one of the things that the former Director General at EPRA had alluded to is that now this G2G tender gives the OMCs 180 days. So that's about 6 months before they actually pay back this money to the banks. And then you have the currency issue. So we don't import the refined petroleum products in Kenya shillings. We import them by using US dollars. So of course, every time there's fluctuations in the US dollars, that again has to be incorporated because fuel is actually sold in Kenya shillings. So taking that conversion is necessary. So that means that, for instance, if the shilling weakens today, so import costs will go up, right? Because you need more Kenya shillings to be able to afford a barrel of refined petroleum products. So after those calculations, right? So we've talked about the free on board, you add the LC, you add the premium and the insurance. Now you add something that's called insurance cost. So this one is supposed to just protect the entire cargo from piracy. If you've watched Pirates of the Caribbean, so it's something like that, accidents that can happen. Sometimes there's cargo loss, sometimes there's environmental incidents, or they're just disruptions during the shipment. And this is not theoretical. It actually has happened. In 1989, for those who are familiar, there was the Exxon Valdez disaster in Alaska, and that led to like massive oil spillage and severe environmental damage. And so events like those is why this insurance component is important, and you will pay whether the goods arrive here safely or not. You still have to incur that cost. And then now, once they get to the port, there's something that now you move to the port-related charges. So the Kenya Ports Authority has a wharfage fee that's added. So think about it like a packing and handling fee. So it's charged at the port for all incoming cargo, and then it normally will lead to the support of like port maintenance and operational activities. And then there's also the SC charge. So this one is just put there in order to improve efficiency and also reduce operational bottlenecks once the ships arrive at the port of Mombasa. So the goal here is just to ensure that there's fast handling, and then there's lower congestion. And then there's another component that's called the OL charge, which accounts for oil losses during transportation. So fuel is a very volatile product. And some losses can either occur through leakages or spillage or evaporation, or just handling inefficiencies. So these potential losses have to be factored into the pricing structure beforehand. So as you can see, that's just the landed cost that has all of those components inside. And then there's something that you call the administrative and compliance costs. So this one, like administration would mostly cover like tender management, it would cover invoicing, compensation structures, and then there's inspection costs. So I know a lot of us are aware, I think a month ago, there was a conversation around fuel that had entered into the country, its sulfur contents were quite high. So these are now the inspection costs that go into that, just trying to determine and verify the quality of the product, the quantity, and all of that, and whether it's actually it complies with safety standards. So that has to be there. Then you have analysis and rectification costs that ensures that the imported fuel that comes into the country meets certain regulatory standards before it is distributed. And then you have one of the costs. I'm still talking about landed costs. So you can see there's a lot that goes into that. So by the time you see that 117 shillings for super petrol, these are all the things that have been taken into consideration. Then you have the demurrage cost. So this one is essentially like a penalty. So for instance, once the ship comes, you're supposed to offload as fast as possible, but sometimes there might be delays for one reason or another. So the port starts to charge you for waiting time. And I think it was in 2023 when the Auditor General actually stated that, Kenya has been charged, I think it was about 3 billion shillings because we had not offloaded as quick as possible. And unfortunately, these costs are passed on to the consumer. So they'll take the 3 billion, divide it by all the liters that came into the country, and then that cost will be added into the landed cost. So one of the things that the government to government deal wanted to do is also try and deal with this demurrage cost. So by the time now you're done with adding all of these components that we've talked about, is when now they take the weighted average and then they determine the landed cost, they convert it into liters, and then now that's when you have the 117, and then you have for diesel, and then you have for kerosene. So every time you see that figure, please note that it has about, I think, 12, 11 components to what makes up the landed cost. So now we go into storage and distribution. Now, the fuel has come, it's arrived in Kenya, it's been financed, it's been insured, it's been inspected, it's been stored, but there's still one major question. How does it actually get from the depot to your local petrol station? And this is now where distribution comes in. So distribution charge essentially covers that movement of the petroleum from the storage facilities and the depots to the retail stations across different countries. But then they usually calculate it based on distance from the nearest wholesale depot. So for example, you have a station here in Nairobi, but you decide you want to source fuel from Mombasa, even though Nairobi has a closer depot. They're not going to compensate you for that whole distance. Because the pricing framework is actually designed to prevent any inefficiencies from being transferred to the consumers. Otherwise, the suppliers could just choose and say, okay, I'm going to get my fuel from as far as possible so that then I can get more money per liter of fuel. That's not the case. So they have that, and it's usually, so every depot, it covers about 40 kilometers radius effectively. Then after every 40 kilometers, you have a different pricing zone. And so that's why even when you check the press releases that are done every 14th, you'll notice that the pump prices in Nairobi are different from the ones in Nakuru, are different from the ones in Mandera, sorry. They're not usually identical. So the farther the region, rather the further the fuel has to travel, then from the supply infrastructure, then the more expensive that it becomes. And this, of course, again, is not unique to Kenya. Many countries often do that. And then in Kenya's case as well, now storage and distribution costs also include, like, the pipeline transport, whether it's trucking, whether it's depot handling, all of that. And then now after that is when, no, actually, before we move on, there's an element where now there's a tariff that's usually charged for transport that moves through the pipeline infrastructure. And this is important because it's not arbitrarily set. The Kenya Pipeline Company would often submit like a tariff application, and that would go through just the normal process where stakeholders are involved, they have a discussion, EPRA scrutinizes it, and then eventually they decide whether or not they will take it. So again, that's the other part that goes into that. And then now we move into the oil marketers margin. Now, after all of this process has happened, the guys that are distributing this petroleum have to make a profit, right? And so that's where the oil marketing companies come in. So for oil marketing companies, you can think of Rubies, you can think like just the names of the different petrol stations that you see. But this oil marketing margin is essentially divided into two. So you have the importer's margin, and then you have the dealer's margin, just to compensate them. Now it is about 17 shillings, which wasn't the case. It was about 12 shillings up to last year. And then there was a cost of study that was done by EPRA. The oil marketers were like, you know what, we're not making enough profit, or operational costs have gone up, and so we need 5 shillings more, which they were given, right? So that's essentially what this does. So for the taxes and levies, because I will speak extensively on them in the next slide, I think we'll just go into now the price stabilization mechanism. Now for this, when prices swing, right? So when there's like currently what we have now, the prices are quite high because of the war that's going on between Iran, Israel, and the US. And so therefore the price of the barrel has gone up, which then the price of refined petroleum products has gone up. And so this price stabilization mechanism, often the government uses it to just try and bring the cost of fuel down. So like now for kerosene, for instance, it would have been 245, but it's about 190. So the 55 shillings, government is subsidizing that. And so that's where the price stabilization comes in. But it's just good to know as well, we don't collect so much from this and when we talk about the taxes, you'll see we don't collect so much from this. So like for instance, like last year, for the entire 12 months, we collected around 26 billion. And the president is on record, I think last month when he was meeting the Matatu Association, and he did say that they've spent about 12 billion. So by the time in one fuel cycle, which is a month, you're spending 12 billion, it means that this money will be depleted quite fast. And so it just goes to show that it's not a sustainable model. Eventually it will crack. So if already we spent 12 the last one, maybe this time we'll spend another 13, that's already 25. So you begin asking yourself, okay, what happens in July, August? If the war continues, what happens? Will government have to look for other ways of stabilizing it? So we're yet to see. So I think that's just something to note, even as we are moving into other fuel cycles. All right, so we can go to the next slide. Thank you. All right. So here I want us to talk about extensively about what each of these taxes do, because we have 11 taxes in total. The first one is the excise duty. So petroleum products in Kenya are usually classified as exercisable goods. So meaning that the government has to impose a tax on them, and this is this is supported actually by the Excise Duty Act. So the importer of this petroleum product is the one that pays the excise duty. Now, if you peruse the Excise Duty Act under Part 1, the rates that are apportioned are 21 shillings and 52 cents for super petrol, 11 shillings and 37 cents for diesel and kerosene, respectively. So one may ask, why do you have to charge excise duty on fuel? First, petroleum generally is just considered to be environmentally harmful. Just remember even the example of the oil spillage and all of that, and probably the marine life that was affected by that. But generally, it's considered that, there's pollution, there's all of this. So government would then want to tax because of that. But even if you look at Kenya's example, you can tell that government is also taxing, or rather putting excise duty, because they consider it as a revenue generation tool, because they think, okay, demand is generally stable and collection is efficient. It's easy to collect this amount. Remember, you collect it when, and I keep saying rubies, so I need to get another example. Let me say National Oil, for example. So when National Oil is importing the kerosene or super petrol or diesel, that's when they are taxed. So it's very easy to collect this. So even if they were to increase it, it would be easy, because it's not like you have to look for people and make them and then collect it from them. So that's excise duty. And then we go to the road maintenance levy. Now, this one is one of the most, I think, visible fuel levies in this country. It's charged at 25 shillings per liter on petrol and diesel. We don't charge it on kerosene, because kerosene is primarily viewed as a household energy product, which is used for cooking and lighting. Now, what does this levy do? Now, in theory, it's meant to fund road maintenance, rehabilitation of roads, road development, and also just transport infrastructure. And the legal basis comes from the Road Maintenance Levy Act. Now, this 25 shillings, not all of it goes like that. It's divided into three components. So the first 15 shillings is what goes to road maintenance and development. Then you have 3 shillings that goes to the road annuity fund. Normally here, think about roads that are constructed by PPPs, private-public partnerships, and then 7 shillings goes towards securitization through the Kenya Roads Board to finance pending bills. Now, the first 15 shilling that we talked about is usually distributed across specific agencies. So Kenya National Highways Authority gets 40% of that. Then Kenya Rural Roads Authority gets 32% of the 15 shillings. And then Kenya Urban Roads Authority receives 15%. Then the Kenya Wildlife Service receives 1%. And then Kenya Roads Board takes 2% for administrative costs. And this levy, I think it generates an enormous amount of money, because if you look at the financial year 2024-2025, the Kenya National Highways Authority got allocated 28.8 billion, and that's 40%. So 100% of that means that we collected about 120 billion. So this to me demonstrates something very important, that fuel taxation in Kenya is not a minor revenue source. It's just deeply embedded in public infrastructure financing. And this also explains why it's very hard reducing fuel taxes, because then it becomes both politically and fiscally different. Because it's very easy for government to say, okay, you want us to remove the RML, so how will roads be financed, And then now you have to give an entire explanation. Now, let's go to the Petroleum Development Levy. Now, this is commonly called the RDL, and this levy is supported under the Miscellaneous Fees and Levies Act, specifically Section 8, subsection 1 and 2. So the law states that all imported goods for home use are subject to the levy. So those passing through the borders, maybe like the fuel that is going to Uganda and all, that one will not fall under this. And the RDL is usually charged at a rate of 2% of the customs value. Again, as well, this one is payable by the importer at the point of entry. Okay. Now, the primary purpose of this fund is the construction and operation of the standard gauge railway network, in order just to facilitate transportation of goods. I know someone might ask, okay, but we don't transport our fuel by the railway line. That is true, but still, it is charged on fuel. And now you can see, like, even with the current pricing cycle, kerosene is the one that's charged the highest at 3.36, and then for super petrol is 2.24. But again, remember, it's 2% of the customs value, and the landed cost for super petrol this time is way lower than that of kerosene and of diesel. So that's why kerosene is contributing more to the railway development levy than the other two. Okay. Then we go to the anti-adulteration levy. So for this one as well, it's supported by the same act, the Miscellaneous Fees and Levies Act. It's only levied on kerosene, okay, at 18 shillings, because historically what used to happen is that some traders would illegally mix kerosene and diesel to reduce the cost and then increase their profit margins. Now, we know that this type of adulteration, it destroys vehicle engines. Of course, it's lower fuel quality, it increases emission and all of that. And so this levy was put in place so that we can be able to bridge the price. And so then it's not profitable in the first place to be able to do that. Then we go to the import declaration fee. So this one is charged at 2.5% of the customs value of imported goods. Again, it's payable by the importer when entering goods for home use. And then now we go to the Petroleum Development Levy. Now, this one currently today, it stands at 5 shillings 40 cents for super petrol and diesel, but then kerosene it's 40 cents. Normally this is the amount that would be collected, and then it would be collected and then it would be used for stabilization. Now, but just a bit of history in terms of the changes that have happened. Before, it actually used to be 40 cents for all the three petroleum products. But then in came the Petroleum Development Levy Amendment Order of 2020, which came into effect on 15th of July. And so they decided for this other two, super petrol and diesel, they have to go up by 5%. And that was a huge increase, because if you calculate it, it's about 1,250%. Very, very high. But anyway, it's the levy that's used to stabilize prices. Remember, we had talked about stabilization and we were saying it's not enough. We just collect about 26 billion in a year. It's also used to finance petroleum infrastructure and all of that. So when prices surge, then that is when this money will be used. But there have been conversations in terms of whether it's been used well or not, or how much is left in the kitty and all of that. So then we go to the Petroleum Regulatory Levy. This is the one that primarily funds the Energy and Petroleum Regulatory Authority, so EPRA. I think I forgot to say in the beginning that EPRA is the one that is in charge of this entire pricing formula. They're the ones that announce the prices. They do market regulation. They are into energy licensing and also just consumer protection within the energy sector. I know they also do a lot of just consumer awareness, even in terms of LPG and all of that. And so that's their work. So this is not their only source of funds. They get money from this fuel regulatory levy, and also the electricity one. They don't get any money from the exchequer. Now, here as well, there have been quite a number of changes, even as I'm about to finish this part. So before, way in January 2018, they used to collect 12 cents per liter. But then later it was changed to 25 cents per liter. But then February of last year, 2024, there were conversations, and they decided to triple this to 75 cents per liter. So now they've moved. So if you were to look at the progress, right, or the increment, sorry, over the period of time from 2018 and now, which is maybe actually less than 10 years, what they get has increased by over 500%. Again, yeah. So then you have the merchant shipping levy. So this levy supports Kenya's maritime and shipping sector infrastructure, oversight, and also operations. And so that's that. And then now value added tax, which is the last one. So when you read the Section 5 of the VAT Act, it actually imposes this tax on taxable goods and services, and petroleum products fall under this. So before, what would happen is that it used to be 8%. Then under this current administration, it went to 16%, I think in 2023. And then 2 months ago, or is it last month, they've reverted it back to 8% in response to the pressure on prices for petroleum because of the shock by the US-Israel-Iran war. Now, the way VAT is calculated is actually quite interesting. So they take all the things we had talked about, the landed costs, the storage and distribution charges, the marketer margins, and all the multiple levies, all of this that we're talking about, excise duty, road, blah, 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 all of those, they add them together, and then they calculate now 8% of that. So it's like taxes on taxes, but that's how they calculate it. And yeah, thank you so much, Emmanuel. I think I will invite Vivian to proceed.
Thank you very much, Fiona, for taking us through that elaborate and long presentation. So I'll take you through the next part, which asks the question of why is Kenya having the fuel shock? And maybe why have we had fuel shocks in the past? So I divided it into two factors. So we have the external factors that affects our fuel prices and factors that makes us have fuel shocks. Then we also have the domestic and the structural factors. So when it comes to the external factors, we know very well that global oil price is volatile. So it's volatile, it is affected by exchange rates, it is affected by a couple of things, and we see some of the effects or some of the factors include wars and geopolitical tensions, and we'll be able to see that reflected in our prices as well. So when there's wars, like we had Ukraine-Russia war, currently there's a war between US, Israel, and Iran. So these tend to affect us and leads to fuel shock. That's why sometimes in history and even earlier this year, we experienced where people are protesting about the fuel prices. Sometimes people end up lining the whole day just to get fuel because there's shortage and there's a shock. Then there's also the OPEC decisions. Then we have the shipping disruption. Fiona's talked to us about what happens, how fuel is shipped to the country. So this can be as a result of wars and even the geopolitical tensions. So they lead to disruption of the shipping. We recently experienced when Iran decided to close the Strait of Hormuz. So, and that affected oil prices and also led to shock in different countries and including Kenya. Then when it comes to domestic, some of the factors that leads to fuel shock is the weakening shilling. So over time, remember, Kenya imports nearly all its fuel, and almost 100% of Kenya's fuel pass through the Strait of Hormuz. And so that means that the exchange rate or the weakening of shillings um, makes it a factor that leads to the fuel shock in the country. Then for the fuel taxes and levy that Fiona has talked about, so those are some of the domestic. And that's why we'll see in our graph that follows that will be able to show us that during COVID-19, our prices were high as compared to the previous years, because despite the lockdowns, despite the demand reducing globally because of the lockdown and a restriction in movement, but in Kenya, because of the fuel taxes and levy, our prices still remained high. Then we are also, some of the structural factors are heavy reliance on road transport. So Kenya, Fiona has explained it, we rely our transportation of food and even other factors of production, they rely heavily on road transport, and road transport, almost 90% of it in Kenya uses fuel. So that when there's a shock, when there's some factors, it really affects us. Then there's also high import dependence. So Kenya imports nearly 100% of its fuel. Then another thing is that no large-scale operation refinery. So we'll let us see if we have a refinery, is it a solution or is it not a solution? So after this, I get to now, how do the shocks affect fuel prices? So we are having this chart one. So chart one shows us the nominal prices for fuel, both super petrol, diesel, and kerosene. So we are able to note that, so for the blue one, super petrol, so it is compared to diesel and kerosene, its price is a bit higher. So that's basically because of its demand as well. Then we have the diesel, which is between kerosene and petrol, the orange line. Then we have the gray line that is representing kerosene. So we are able to see, so this is data from 2014, January, all the way to 2026. So I want to focus most on the hikes, the time when the prices go high. So we are seeing in between 2019, 2020, during COVID period, the fuel prices in Kenya was high, and I've explained the reason it was high despite the global demand for fuel reducing because of the lockdowns and also the restriction. So because domestically we have those taxes and levies, so the fuel prices in Kenya remained relatively high because of that COVID-19 shock. Then it kept on rising. We didn't recover really well. Then it rose again very high between 2022 2023. This was because of the Ukraine and Russia war. We know when the Russia invaded Ukraine between 2022 and 2023. And you know that Russia exports almost 10% of the, Russia supplies almost 10% of the world's oil. So when there was this disruption, it led to the global rise in oil prices. Then it went a bit low, but it has risen in 2026. And we know what happened from 1st March 2026 when US and Israel invaded Iran. And there was this led to the closure of sometimes the there was disruption of the Strait of Hormuz, and we know that 20% of global oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz, and almost 100% of Kenya's petroleum passes through the same Strait of Hormuz. So because of that war, it has led to the high prices. And if the war continues, we are seeing in April 2026, the prices are still going up and up. And we are even seeing that in our when April announces the petroleum prices, they are ever raising it higher and higher because of that. So this chart is able to tell us that whenever there is a crisis, there's geopolitical tension, there's war, it translates into our prices, and we bear the costs by paying high prices for fuel, petroleum, diesel, and kerosene. Then after understanding the shock, now we go to what are Kenya's fuel options? What options do we have as Kenya? So I'll take you through the first option, then I'll invite Kwame to take us through the next section. So the first option is crude oil refinery. So it is a question, is it okay to have our own refinery? So that brings me now to the economics of a refinery. For us to understand whether it is good or it is economically good to have a refinery, we need to understand how does a refinery works and what are the revenues and what are the costs if we can bear them. So economics of a refinery. So economics of something basically study whether it makes economic sense to examine the costs, the benefits, and also the risks. So for a refinery, so how does a refinery works? So a refinery adds value by it converts crude oil to so it takes it through a process, then it converts it to petroleum, diesel, jet fuel, or liquefied petroleum gas, LPGs. So that is how a refinery works. So the how it earns a profit, or how it so how it earns a profit is when the product sales exceed the refining cost. So there's the refining cost, and we also have the product sale. And the product sale is here, the sale from petroleum, diesel, and jet fuel. So we need to understand what are the main economic drivers of a refinery. So the first one is revenue. So how do they generate revenue? So a refinery generates revenue by sale of these refined petroleum products. Then what are the costs? Because for a refinery to be built, there are costs to be there are certain costs that need to be incurred. So some of the costs, we have the crude oil costs. So according to the analysis, it shows that crude oil cost, just importing that crude oil, because in Kenya we don't have the capacity of getting all the crude oil needed to be refined into petroleum. So we import. So if it is imported, so it accounts for nearly 7 to 90% of the total costs. So that is just the importation of the crude oil. Then we have now the refining margin. This is now like the profit. So how do they make profit? It is also referred to as the crack spread. How do they make profit? So profit arises when from the difference between product value. The products we've seen is petroleum, diesel, and jet fuel, and also the crude oil cost. So what is the difference? If the difference is positive, then they are making a profit. If the difference is negative, then they are not making a profit. Then there's other operational costs. So other than the crude oil costs, we have other operational costs. So these include labor, the employees that will work. Then we have the energy cost. We have the maintenance cost. So for water, chemicals, this environmental cost, and even the logistic costs. So all these costs need to be considered. Then there's also capital investments. So refineries do require billions of dollars to construct and maintain. They are not expensive. They are not cheap. They are quite expensive. They are capital intensive. Then, so that brings us now to critical success factors. So what makes a refinery to be successful or not? So refineries are most successful when they operate at large scale. So that is the first one. When there's high efficiency and also they operate near the full capacity. So you cannot construct a refinery, but its operation, if it's supposed to maybe give 1,000 barrels of oil, then it gives maybe less than that, maybe 900 or 800. So it is not operating to its full capacity. So therefore it may not be successful. Then we have now the economics of scale, some things to consider or some success factors. So when a refinery is large enough, then it have lower cost per barrel. So the larger the refinery, the lower the cost of producing a barrel. Then it comes, there's complexity. So in complexity, this deals with technology that is applied in that refinery. So we find that advanced refineries can process cheaper crude oil and produce more high value fuels. So if it is advanced, it can process it cheaper and also produce high quality. So when there's cheaper cost of production, it reduces the cost. And when there's high quality, it increases the prices. So it makes that profit margin higher. Then we also have the capacity utilization. So profit increases when refineries operate close to full capacity. So I've explained that. Then there's also reliable crude supply. So there should not be disruption when it comes to operating a refinery. But we have seen that we experience shocks because we import our oil, and there sometimes because of the closure of the pathways or the Strait of Hormuz and where our oil passes, it leads to shock. So for a refinery to work effectively, there should be a reliable crude oil supply or source. Then there should also be a strong demand, both domestically, and it should also be able to export also to earn profit as well. So to conclude on this, just to say that building a refinery does not automatically guarantee economic benefits. So that's a fact. Then many countries have found that importing a refined fuel is even cheaper than refining it locally. So for a refinery to be viable, it must operate efficiently. We have seen that. It must process sufficient volumes and have access to reliable crude oil and fuel markets. Then that brings us to a question, having that in mind. So is reviving maybe Changamwe refinery a solution? So it may come with better benefits like greater energy security, reduced import dependence because we import nearly all our fuel. Then arguments may be it may create job and industrial growth. Then it is a more reliable supply. But there are challenges that are quite intense. So we have seen that refineries are very capital intensive. So when reviving this, we need to remember that some of the challenges, remember it shut down back in 2013. So we need to remember that challenges include having a refinery or maintaining it and even constructing it. It is it needs very large amount of capital. Then it is difficult. Some of the challenges, it's difficult to compete with mega refineries. Then we understand that crude oil is still bought at world prices. So when there's volatility in exchange rate, so it still will be affecting the refinery. Then it does not eliminate global shocks. So when there's a global shock whereby we cannot receive the crude oil, then it will not be effective and it won't work as desired. So that is all about the refinery solution. So I'll invite Kwame to take us through the second solution, that is the strategic petroleum reserve. Thank you.
Thanks, Vivian and Fiona. So, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for being here. Remember, the purpose of our conversation today is to say that nobody in Kenya today doubts that there's been the shock starting with the crisis in the Persian Gulf have had their own effects into Kenya, and the effects are not only economic. I think some of it has been seen or surfaced in the form of some protests with unfortunate deaths. And of course, there's political tension around that. And that conversation is going because in another 14 days, there's going to be another price adjustment. In addition to that, Fiona has demonstrated that oil shocks in Kenya tend to affect every sector, even while it's clear that given all the energy consumed in Kenya, the energy demand in Kenya, right, measured in kilowatt hours, basically, or rather in kilojoules, one of the things that happens is Kenya still has a very pre-industrial structure in the sense that a majority of the energy consumed in Kenya used within households and farms, if you put everything together, still comes from biomass. So that's like a pre-industrial structure. So petroleum is responsible for about 2%, 1 and a bit percentage points of all the energy consumed in Kenya. But it has a very high profile because it's a very modern sector. It's very, very modernized. It has good infrastructure. It is connected to many other sectors of the economy in direct and indirect way, and therefore drives production, transportation, and obviously, therefore costs of energy, and all the way to the cost of other products that are transported using petroleum. And so in that discussion, one of the things that we hope is evident to you is that Kenya has, as Fiona demonstrated, a mechanism for managing the price. So it looks like Kenya is conscious of the fact that, yes, we are a petroleum import dependent country. And therefore those global shocks, whether they come from foreign exchange shocks or from a political contest, such as the one we see in the political and military contest, such as the one we see in the Middle East today, it has had consequences for the prices in Kenya. And therefore the volatility, which economists call price moving, is one of the things that's being debated. And we've had many people speak about many things from, look, we should re-establish a refinery in Kenya, requiring government investment. And my colleague Vivian has demonstrated that the economics of a refinery, given that Kenya only consumes 100,000 barrels per day, usually requires that for a country that is importing, needs to be able to import very cheap petroleum globally, add value by way of refinement, and then export most of it. So Kenya would have to be export competitive as a manufacturing hub for petroleum, or manufacture it together with the region. So it's not a solution that's that easy because it's also very capital intensive. So for instance, as she suggested, a petroleum refinery that requires an output of 200,000 barrels per day. 200,000, remember, that would be twice what Kenya consumes. In other words, if Kenya was to invest in one like that, it would have to be able to export the 50%. Why? Because petroleum refineries are also most efficient when they're operating at full capacity. So if you make that very basic assumption, it would mean that Kenya would have to invest between $10 to $15 billion, which is 10% of Kenya's GDP in one facility to be able to have a throughput of only 100,000 barrels. The economics doesn't seem to be sound. But regardless, it's dependent on being able to actually expand markets to be efficient and to provide that infrastructure. So that's the first one. So we are exploring the other possibility that's been explored again here, and the fiscal reality. So is a strategic petroleum reserve a good idea for Kenya? And the strategic petroleum reserves history is there are many countries throughout the world, started around the mid-70s, when oil shocks started to come out due to political consequences. And what a strategic petroleum reserve is basically keeping in stock, storing petroleum at certain quantities and hoping to smooth consumption so that when the shocks take place, when the prices go too high, whichever country would be able to actually release them. The US has released quite some stocks. The other countries, they tend to be high-income countries or petroleum-producing countries, which are reducing. So why is this question being discussed? We've mentioned that. And there's been a recent announcement by the Cabinet Secretary for Energy in a press statement in which he says that there's a consideration to establish a strategic petroleum reserve. In addition, that has been echoed by the Member of Parliament for Gwasi constituency. Sorry, in stating Gwasi constituency, we were auto-corrected and we didn't edit that, but we'll edit. Karoli Omondi, speaking before Parliament in response to the recent price hikes, and is saying that government responds to the Ministry of Energy and obviously the other offices, the Ministry of Finance, and even with the reduction or the reduction by 50% of the VAT on petroleum is insufficient. So in his view, one of the things that Kenya should explore is a strategic petroleum reserve. The drivers of these arguments, in addition to many other arguments that have been made, including by people in the public sector, but we insist about people in the private sector because those in the public sector, because those in the public sector are decision makers. So they need to be conscious about what the implications of these are. So one, they say that the political volatility in the Persian Gulf is not something that Kenya can control. That's true. And the recent closure of the Strait of Hormuz, which many people expected to be a short conflict, has gone on for too long. And yet this is a vital artery for Kenya's fuel supply, given that most of Kenya's supply comes from three countries right in the thick of this confrontation. One is Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and of course, Qatar and Oman. So their energy policy goal is that they should shield consumers from global supply shocks that spike retail prices. And that seems to be a self-evident policy goal. But let's examine it for its merits. In our next slide, we are showing it is clear that energy security as they defined, which is basically the ability to defend domestic consumers from those shocks, is a sensible goal. But energy security is not costly. And you're trying to examine that before you speak about the goal, to examine that across its fiscal consequences, which tells us in slide 15, Kenya's fiscal reality today is this basically. Kenya has severe fiscal constraints, which will demonstrate there's high debt sustainability concerns and there's full dependence on imported fuel. And so if the government of Kenya is going to make a decision, it's making a decision about establishing a strategic petroleum reserve with this reality as a given. So Kenya's fiscal deficit is this. If you look at the more than 10 years of fiscal reality, you can tell here that this is the fiscal deficit in real terms, the fiscal deficit, which is basically how much money government has to borrow to top up on the revenues the government of Kenya has been collecting. And you can see that it's moved from something like 23 billion in 2007, basically up to 1 trillion shillings in the last budgets. So that's basically a deteriorating fiscal position in terms of the fiscal deficit. So that's one thing to bear in mind. This is fact. As we go next, so basically what we're saying is that the idea is that the quest to invest in a strategic petroleum reserve has to be against the reality of that deteriorating fiscal position over close to 15 years. But what's the baseline scenario? What has been stated in some of those is basically for Kenya to build a buffer, which is basically stocks, build a facility in which petroleum can be stored. It can be stored in many ways. It can be stored in private tanks, it can be stored in a pipeline, it can be stored in a specific facility that has been built. But they're saying that Kenya should build between 3, some people have spoken as much as 6 months, but we took 3 months because it helps us to illustrate the point sufficiently. So the reserve size would be equivalent to 3 months of domestic use. Kenya's domestic demand is close to 100,000 barrels per day. So that over 90 days would come to 9 million barrels. The base oil price was the base oil price that applied at the time this war started. And at that time, it was close to 76. But we round it up to 80 just for the purposes of making this a neat one. You know that you've seen that the capital that the government of Kenya is borrowing, right? As you've seen, the fiscal deficit is actually closer to 10%, but we take 8%, which is usually where it was at its lowest in the same 15-year period. So the annual, in addition to building a strategic reserve, and remember when you talk about a strategic reserve, we are not talking about the cost of building the reserve itself. We are simply talking about the cost of getting the stocks and keeping that stock. Fuel, you've been told, is very volatile, so it means that there'd have to be circulation of tanks over time. And that's annual storage and maintenance. Annual storage and maintenance usually comes from something like $3 to $7 per barrel per year. We have taken the lower bound of it to illustrate our problem once again. And of course, the price hike is basically any shock that would lead to the price rising from, say, $8 to about 120. Yes, you're right. Right now, prices are closer to about 108 or basically that. But it still illustrates the fact that fuel prices will rose by at least 50%, which of course has a knock-on effect. So let's go down to the next slide. So the formula here in calculating, remember, we are saying that it is agreed that a strategic reserve holding 9 million barrels of oil is available to Kenya. What does that require for the investment? It is 9 million barrels at the cost of $80 per unit would be 720 million, which would be the investment. Now, for a low-income country, this would require perhaps issuing a sovereign debt because 720 million dollars is basically $720 million at today's exchange rates, comes down to closer to 100 billion Kenya shillings, right? Yes, close to 100 billion Kenya shillings, just slightly more than 100 billion then. But let's keep it as that 700. For a low-income country, that means it's equivalent to 10% of government borrowing per year, based on the sliding, deteriorating fiscal space. So that's a step one. That would have to be given. Step two is that money would have to be tied up in oil, right? And it also has borrowing costs every year. When you borrow that 720 million, the initial cost is 720 million. Cost of capital is 8% per annum. It means that in addition, the 720 million shillings which is placed in the stocks would have an opportunity cost for that money that is borrowed of 57.6 million per annum, because you're keeping the stocks on. That would have to be a permanent stock of 3 months of fuel, always available to the country to respond to any shock. In our next slide, so our step 3. So what's the total annual storage, maintenance, and holding cost? Because there's the cost of acquiring the petroleum. We assume that the base price is 80. And then because of the borrowing, a financial instrument would have to be issued at 8% conservative. So the formula basically is the reserve size, which is 9 million barrels, at $3 per barrel, which is basically the cost of storage, security, it's the cost of insurance, environmental compliance, rotation across the tanks, and including the security, because keeping 9 million barrels of oil would require security in itself, in addition to, of course, other premiums of insurance. So that basically comes to $27 million per year. So the cost of maintaining the stocks, of the holding costs, would be the cost of capital, which is 57.6 million coming from the interest that is acquired, that is run every year, and the 27 million, which is basically the cost of the annual operations and maintenance costs, which is another 27 million. Meaning that just by spending $720 million to keep 9 million barrels, the government of Kenya would have to maintain that at 84 or close to $85 billion per year. This is the guaranteed amount the government must spend annually just to maintain the reserve. So that's the cost of maintaining the reserve, which is the cost of the interest on the initial investment, in addition to the 27 million, very conservative, which is the lowest price that you keep, that is required to keep every barrel, that rotation across the tanks, the environmental compliance cost, the insurance that's required to keep the safety, and of course the security of securing that storage facility. That's where we are, meaning that apart from spending $720 million to keep the stock, to buy the stock, government would need to run another $84 million, close to $85 million per year to keep that stock for as long as that policy is in place. The next slide, we are showing step 4. Step 4. So this is step 3. Oh yes, and step 4 is the 4th, basically. So we go to step 5. Sorry. In our step 5, yes. So remember, one of the things that's clear that many people don't know, students of finance and economics understand, and accountants understand this very, very clearly. When you say that you're trying to protect Kenyans from shock of high prices based on political or other events outside the country, it's the equivalent of insurance. So basically what you're saying is that we want to insure Kenyans against very volatile prices based on political, economic, or other social conditions outside our control. What that means is government would need a payout rule, which is basically under what circumstances would this be activated. And what has been suggested, for instance, or what many countries apply, is when a crisis raises prices by at least 50% from the baseline price, which is that 80, and 50% from that baseline price would be 120, right? Then at that point, the fuel reserve would be released into the market. So if you look at that, the formula then is the reserve size, which is 9 million barrels, right? The saving is $40 per unit, because you'd have to sell at the point, at the same price as government had bought for, which means that the premium that goes to the public will be 360 million shillings in savings, because then it doesn't top up in a direct linear way. So it basically means that you're spending that 720 million in units and another 85 million per year to ensure that you can cushion this economy from 360 million in savings for the entire savings. That's basically what it means. And so that means that's the equivalent of the insurance package that government is buying to ensure that safety of supply. In our next slide, 6. So what is the break even? So basically what you're saying is if you make that investment, right, that is just your input cost. We need to ask ourselves, how long would it take for the government to break even to make that investment worth it? So in terms of the payback period. And so what that means is the crisis savings, which is $360 million that we demonstrated before for the entire 9 million barrels, divided by the total holding costs. In other words, you say, for how long would I have to hold this fuel? Or how long would the crisis will have to take place for me to release the fuel? What is the frequency that is required for that for that benefit to be issued based on what the insurance will be? And it's telling you that by government of Kenya choosing to store an $80 barrel of oil at the cost that we've demonstrated, it means that you're saying that the payoff would come out because you're paying $84 million to keep them, or $85 million to keep them. It means that you're anticipating that after every 4.25 years, the cumulative holding cost exceeds the savings from one major crisis. So that means that the idea is, the policy interpretation you must take from this is that after about less than 4.5 years, the cumulative holding costs exceeds the savings, suggesting that if a crisis takes place less frequently than this, right, then it is not worth holding the supply. In other words, it means that when Honorable Karoli Omondi on one side and Honorable Wandai on the other, CS for Energy, are saying that we want to keep 3 months of supply at the prices that we mentioned, which is the prices that obtained when this crisis started, they're making the assumption that this kind of crisis that is being faced today occurs 1 in 4.5 years. If it does not, if it occurs by a greater frequency, that's even better. If it does not, then this is not a good way for ensuring that supply is assured. So it's not a good insurance mechanism. So that's a break-even timeline. That's the assumption that is made. As we go to the next step, so what is a summary of the key inputs to the SPR? Because we're going to go into an analysis of this as an insurance policy, which is basically what it is in economic terms. So the variable, the reserve size is 9 million barrels. How did we get to 9 million barrels? It's equivalent to 3 months of fuel consumption in Kenya based on present rates. About 100,000 barrels per day, coming to 3 million per month, and therefore 9 million over 3 months. The base oil price was 80 per barrel, which is basically what was us. We said it was about 76 or thereabouts, but 80 would be still okay. The cost of capital is 8%, and this is a conservative sum based on what we thought was the lowest over the 15-year period in which we saw government's fiscal condition deteriorate. The annual operating and maintenance cost, which we've talked about, insurance, security, rotation, infrastructure maintenance, environmental compliance, will be about $3 per barrel. Again, this is on the lowest of the lowest and the most efficient refineries globally. Then the total annual holding cost, as we've demonstrated, is 84.6 million, based on the cost of 8% capital cost, but the cost of the 8% capital cost plus the annual operations and maintenance cost per barrel. Now, says the savings per crisis is $40 per spike, which would be 360 million when the entire reserve has to be exhausted. And obviously, it saves 360 million, which would have been paid in the additional cost. So the break-even crisis frequency has to be once every 4.25 years. So the question we need to ask ourselves, or we need to debate, which is a good thing, is, do we think that at the prevailing costs of fuel, when this crisis started at the end of February but early March, it affected all energy prices, do we think that the frequency of this conflict will occur more than once every 5 years? More. In other words, it says that every 5 years, it should be like a 2 or 3 times. If it is not, then based on the existing prices, maintaining a strategic petroleum reserve is not good economic policy. In our next slide, so remember that we are now analyzing the consequences of maintaining a strategic petroleum reserve is as if you're buying an insurance policy. That's what you're doing, because you're trying to ensure the lower volatility. So you're insuring for a risk of high volatility, which might generate consequences for the economy. Now, the economic insight here is we are asking ourselves, if you stretch it to a 10-year timeline, how many crises would it have to take for that justification to go to maintain the reserve based on the same prices over 10 years? So we've come from what your assumptions of the frequency would be. We're now adopting a longer term frequency because someone might say, but this might happen more often than not, that this might be the new normal on the crisis in the Gulf or in the Persian Gulf or Western Asia, as we call it. So now we're asking ourselves, if you look at the first column of the table here, which is table 3, we are asking ourselves, what number of crises would it take? How much would the savings of each crisis be every 10 years? And what's the total cost over 10 years? Now, the 846 is because you're holding 84.6 million per year as your cost, right? Based on the cost of operations and maintenance on one side and the financial cost. So it's 846. We're asking ourselves, how many times would this shock have to occur for the net benefit to turn positive? And here is what it's telling us. If the crisis, such as the one we face today, is only one in a 10-year crisis, your total savings will be 360 million. But your holding cost over 10 years is 846. It means it is not worth holding because the net benefit turns negative. If, however, we think that the crisis frequency will double, right, making the total savings, of course, double as well, your total holding cost will be 846. And therefore, even that still makes the net benefit negative. It only turns positive if we think that the crisis that we are facing today, based on the same metrics that we've measured and we've spoken about, occurs at least once every 3 years. So that in a 10-year period, we'd have seen similar shocks, swinging prices by 50%, right? Every 3 years or less. And then that brings it to the net benefit actually still comes down to 234. And of course, it gets bigger the more. So in other words, what this is telling us that the economic insight from this break-even probability chart. And why are we going into break-even probability? Because the economic consequences of trying to smooth spending, prices of fuel, is equivalent to buying an insurance policy. So you're trying to do insurance. And the analysis of it must be based on the probability of the risk occurring. So you can tell here, as if the risk is more than twice every 10 years, which is once every 5 years, or once every 2 years, try once every 3 years, then the benefit becomes better. Telling you that the sensitivity of this strategic petroleum reserve as considered, being an insurance policy, would lead an actuary to ask, what assumptions are we making about the frequency of this supply problem that we have right now? And you can tell the bigger it is, the higher the total number of savings, and therefore, because the holding cost has to be the same over those 6 years, over those 10 years, therefore the 954 million in net gains makes it justifiable. So I will bring us back to economic insight, which tells us that unless Kenya thinks, with people in the energy ministry, or Kenyans, we have a consensus that we think that the norm has been such that we will have 3 crises per decade, which is equivalent to almost once every 3 years, equivalent to more frequent than even the severe famines that we have in Kenya, because the famines in Kenya, I think, is once every 5 years. Severe famines in Kenya, once every 6 or so years. So that means that the oil cost, shock cost, has to be twice as severe or rather as frequent as the drought in Kenya. Then this would be a good policy instrument to consider. But that's not just it as well. So we want to make sure that we have exhausted totally the risks profile. Remember, again, we are considering this an insurance policy. So what else might be considered? Next slide we're showing in table 4. So basically what we're asking ourselves, what we're trying to ask ourselves is, what is the weighted cost? Now, this is the weighted cost of $40 per barrel. We're asking, even if a crisis could save us 360 million, and that's what we say, because it's saving 60 million by doubling of the price of fuel from 80 to 120, creating $360 million worth of savings. The likelihood is low enough that the expected economic value is negative unless the risk is is a probability higher than 20%. So now we have come from what assumptions we are making about the frequency, but now we're saying that how often would a $40 swing in prices or a 50% swing in prices have to occur to make the cost probability per year? So if we say it's only 5% of expected, which is very optimistic, right? Crisis probability per year, which is very optimistic. As you can tell again, it's all negative because the annual cost remains the same. The expected savings, of course, shifts by the difference between what the price is and the cost. What this tells us is we have to make the assumption that there's a 25% risk of the price moving by $40 per year. So this time is not about a 10-year range. There's a 25% risk that any 1 year the price would move by $40 per barrel to justify maintaining the strategic petroleum reserve as it is. And we looked at over the last 20 years from basic numbers, and we haven't found more than 2 price shocks in which the price moved by 50% or by $40 all within the same year, suggesting that this would not be the best way to actually spend public money. So we've come from what would be a longer term horizon to just asking ourselves within a year, how much would the price have to shift, right? The probability that the price has to shift over a year. We're not talking about the risk over 10 years. We're talking about the price year by year, over $40 per barrel per year, all within 1 year to justify. So if you think it's a very 5%, which is very optimistic, it doesn't justify it. It only justifies it by saying that there's a 1 in 4 chance every year that the price of fuel would shift by $40 a barrel. If that was the risk profile that you're facing over time, then it justifies per barrel. But if not, because $360 million is what we would be saved in Kenya, the likelihood is low enough. It's very, very low that the expected economic value is negative unless the risk is probability is higher than 20%, because 20% is where it almost tips from negative things. And even then at 25, the net expected benefits is only $5.4 million to the entire economy of Kenya. So that's basically a significant factor here. So we're trying to make sure that we considered all probability scenarios and not just how long it takes for the return to be made. Remember, this is one of the techniques that is used to assess, because we agreed this is being considered as an insurance policy. So as we go towards our conclusion, next slide, guys. So we understand, we ask ourselves, $84.6 million per year is what we're saying. We've shown that it's very difficult unless you make very aggressive assumptions that the world has become extremely dangerous. Substitutes for oil are really bad to justify not only spending $720 million, which can be fixed sum, but also after that, you're spending another $84.5 million per year. So we ask ourselves, what is the opportunity cost for spending this $84.5 million? $84.6 million per year, for instance, instead of putting it in an oil reserve when you think it'll only occur once in this number of years, or it'll shift 40% of the time. Only 25% of the time. The risk is 25% of the time every year, or rather a $40 shift all within a year. It's very, very, but we're asking ourselves, even if you went by that, one of the ways to think about what would we forego to invest in such a low probability event, and where the gains are also not going to be material. So one of these is tarmac roads. If you consider tarmac road as $2 million per tarmac road, say in a rural area, that's usually about the price for a tarmac road. Not the very heaviest duty, but a tarmac road which is all weather in rural areas. At $2 million, it means every year, right, you'd be able to construct 45 kilometers of road in a rural area. That's not nothing. So we need to say this is what you'd have to forgo every year to be able to maintain the strategic petroleum reserves. For secondary schools bursary, I've calculated here, it is 210,000 bursaries per year added to what already exists at secondary school kids. Take them through school. I hope not through residential schools where they might suffer a crisis. But I'm talking about building, making sure that you have a bursary for a child based on Ministry of Education rates 210,000 kids going to secondary schools. Remember, there are about 4 million kids in secondary schools. It means you'll be adding 5% more per year for forever to the number of kids who go to primary schools, to secondary schools. Life-saving drugs based on what the basic malaria treatment, it's treatment, not prevention, 4.2 million malaria patients would get drugs. That's probably the service in the whole country for the year. And then, of course, if you think about training of doctors, if you consider that you train one doctor for 15 million, and therefore for every $1 million you train 10, for instance, it means that the cost here of maintaining the strategic reserve at the costs that we've talked about, which are reasonable and based on reference facts for 2026 in May, would be 850 doctors, additional 850 doctors per year added, basically in terms of capacity. So whether it's expanding capacity of the medical school, perhaps even establishing a new medical school, because I know that Kenyan doctors, the number of doctors trained in Kenya per year is probably not even 2,000 per year. But this would be a material one, right? Close to another 30% addition to the number of doctors trained. You can't say we don't need doctors. So I'm about to finish, and as I go towards the last slide, let's go, guys, slide. So would an SPR policy be worth it? I think to ask that question after we've looked at the numbers, it's conditional on one assumption. The condition will be severe global crisis must occur at least once every 4 years. And that crisis must be the kind that shifts prices by 50% from the baseline, which is say from 80 to 120, right? And the main thing that we are trading off is that it protects the domestic economy against extreme price hikes. But there's a very high annual carrying cost for a fiscally constrained economy, such as Kenya. It tilts heavily against the fact that given these facts and the prices and what the policy options are for it, it tilts very heavily against establishing a strategic petroleum reserve. So what is our recommendation? I think the government of Kenya would have to consider either a very small reserve, though even that would suffer from these numbers. Remember, in considering the cost of the reserve, we consider the financial cost without considering the cost of the strategic facility itself, which might have to be either hired from a private sector firm or hired from another source. But also one thing that you need to consider as students of economics is if the strategic petroleum reserve made sense in Kenya today, I think private sector would construct it. Perhaps because of the smallness of the reserves, Kenya would have to explore joint regional reserves, because if the reserve was bigger, it is possible that those numbers would tilt heavily. And perhaps we should just hedge the risk via financial instruments. And we looked at it and we said, remember, in the end, we are arguing that trying to protect from deep swings and fluctuations in prices is basically just buying an insurance policy. And if you look at it globally, there are hedge instruments that are available, and many of them on a year-by-year basis just pay $2 per barrel for a swing in prices of a big amount. So the government of Kenya was to organize this strategic petroleum reserve will not necessarily be a physical reserve of stocks, but it could actually have virtual reserves of cash. Not the levy fund, but just basic cash, which would be used to fashion a financial instrument, perhaps putting in Kenyan banks and together with some international institutions to fashion financial instruments, right, which allows the government of Kenya to offload that risk or share that risk. And there are very possible hedging instruments, from what I read, suggest that something like very rarely does it get to $5 per barrel. Very rarely does it get to $5 per barrel for a big swing. So it is possible to establish this facility as an insurance policy that is hedged through a financial instrument, does not require establishing physical stocks, but would ensure that that risk is borne by somebody who's more capable of bearing it, including by dealing with the source countries or the source firms that are able to assure stocks over sustainability of stocks over time. So, as we conclude, I think the government of Kenya should repeal the pricing structure. One, because the pricing structure has just proved to us that it's not able to protect Kenyans against shocks. It's also a contradiction in itself, because it says, if you have a pricing structure that requires that when petroleum prices are cheap, you charge people higher, and then you circulate that money over time, and then you wait for the prices to go up and then spend the same amount of money. I think that's a fiscal illusion. You're simply creating a fiscal illusion. We have a policy blog, a brief that we wrote, which we sent to a couple of people in government, but which we have on the IEA's website, which talks about what the fiscal illusion has led to and what are the options. Our view is that this pricing structure should be completely repealed. If government wishes to be involved together with the private sector, I think an option of a hedging instrument would be more useful, unless an East African reserve could be considered. Still, it would face big, it would face very, very big headwinds in terms of being viable as an instrument, given the fact that most of that oil would have to be bought and placed at very high premium in terms of the borrowing costs annually. I think that's it, right?
Yeah, so it's me again. Changing of taxes. So I'm sure we've had suggestions from different people just to reduce the road maintenance levy by 7 shillings. And so here we built a bit of scenario. I know we've spent the last 30 minutes going through the math, so I'll try and make it very simple. So just okay. Now let's look at the current situation, right? Remember the beginning of this webinar, we said the 25 shillings is divided. 3 shillings goes to the road annuity fund, 7 shillings goes to securitization, 15 shillings goes towards maintenance. Yeah. Now, the proposed structure currently as it is that the Finance Bill 2026 wants to reduce the amount that goes to the road annuity fund by half. So it will be 1.5. So if it passes and if it's enacted and it becomes an act, so that's what will happen. Remember, this is the development of roads, either through like public partnerships or just some roads. And then securitization, there have been conversations, I think from late last year, beginning of this year, where they want to increase it to 12 shillings. And then that would leave only 11.5 shillings for road maintenance. Now, when we go to the proposal that has been fronted, which is reducing this levy by 7 shillings, it means it goes back to the original 18 shillings. So if it goes back to the 18 shillings and the Finance Bill of 2026 becomes an act, then the securitization is maintained at 12, it means that we have only 4.5 shillings to be able to do any maintenance of roads. Now, the current situation, already we have seen some roads that have been earmarked to be maintained, and they're probably not being maintained. Now, there's for the financial year that ended June 2025, the Kenya National Highways Authority was audited by the Auditor General. They had actually planned to maintain about 15,394 kilometers of road. They were only able to do 69% of that. So already with the 15 shillings maintenance, we have such a performance rate. It means that if we reduce it by 7 shillings, and we only have 4.5 shillings, which I think is about not even half of that amount, then you can see what will probably happen to in terms of maintenance. I know there's also a conversation for, okay, let's remove the securitization, because there've been conversations around that in terms of, it's being deemed as discrete borrowing. There's the element where there's lack of adequate parliamentary oversight, and all of that. So if it is actually removed, then it's fine. The finance bill again for 2026 is a low 1.5, and then maintenance becomes 16.5. But it doesn't look like we're moving towards removing securitization. And so therefore, if we reduce it by 7 shillings, we're looking at 1.5, 12, and 4.5. So that's the conversation around reducing the maintenance, road maintenance levy. Let's go to the next slide. Yes. Now, as the IEA, we've come up with a suggestion and we're saying, how about all these levies that we talked about, all of these taxes are actually capped at 30% of the landed costs, okay? And to make this simpler and more transparent, we're calling it the petroleum energy duty. Now, this would replace all the taxes that we talked about. So excise duty, VAT, petroleum development levy, road maintenance levy, railway development levy, all the 11 of them, and they're consolidated into one. Now let's look at the May-June cycle. For super petrol, the landed cost are 117 shillings. The current taxes for super petrol is 74 shillings. That means that when you take taxes as a percentage of landed cost, it is 62.9%. The next line is diesel, the next one is kerosene, okay? So we are saying that if this was applied in this May-June cycle, it means that the taxes for super petrol would have been 35 shillings, that of diesel would have been 50, and that of kerosene would have been 51. Now for kerosene, there's no major difference, it's just like a shilling. And that would have then made the price of super petrol to come down to 175. Diesel would have come down by 216, and kerosene would have come down by 190 to 190. I know there's someone who's probably asking, kerosene is more expensive than super petrol. If you look at the landed cost, you can see that the landed cost for kerosene was much higher than that of super petrol. And so therefore, if you employ this formula, definitely that would be the price. And this is the price even after stabilization. And on top of that, the proposal would mean that, for instance, EPRA would have to publish a monthly tax transparency statement. So here they would just show us how they've distributed this. So for instance, if it was the 50 shillings for diesel, they'd show us how they've distributed it across, say, what amount goes to road maintenance, what amount goes to EPRA, and all of that, and all of that. And then for this to take effect, then it means that certain acts will have to be amended. Remember the conversation about the different acts that that give life to the different taxes, so that would have to be amended. Okay, so before we go even to the questions and answers, there's also the element of VAT. I know that there have been suggestions to do away completely with VAT, and there's also, again, just maintaining the 8%, but VAT being calculated on the landed costs. Yes, so we are done. I think we will hand it back to Emmanuel for the Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all for attending. Now to the question and answer. What have we gone over? We have covered together the state of play in global oil markets very briefly. Then we looked at the actual market structure um, of Kenya's petroleum market, how the market arrives at the given price, what factors influence the price both domestically and around the world, and then given these factors, then where can Kenya go? And going backwards, we looked at how we can change the taxes, the tax structure that we currently enjoy. What changes can be made to each contributing factor, or each factor that contributes to the total cost, right? Whether we're talking about the landed cost, um, and then we talked about the viability of building our own refinery. And finally, we talked about getting rid of the price control mechanism itself. So now we open the plenary to the plenary. Welcome your questions. Cheers. So you can type your questions in the box, or you can lift your hand and ask. So first we have Sifuna here. what does the Dangote investment in Kenya mean to the Kenya's economy, the fuel sector, the pricing? I think here primarily there's something about the viability of refinery. And so we can take three. The second question, um, okay, I see I think your name is Winnie. Let's see. Winnie raises her hand. Okay, so disable your microphone and open your camera, and you can ask your.
Hi, Manny. I have a question for Fiona. Fiona has unpacked for us all the taxes that, when the fuel price calculations are being done, are taken into consideration. And what I wanted to ask is if the IEA was to do its own calculations based on the taxes that she has explained, would we arrive at the same fuel price, or we go back to there are some hidden costs? And if there are hidden costs, then where does that leave this whole calculation? Because it would be important as part of the recommendations. Therefore, if at all there are hidden costs, and Fiona will elaborate, then that should be factored in and explained. And then also back to Fiona. I know she did a blog on this whole fuel conversation, and she tried to explain an argument that Kenyans have been making. And I think the protests that were taking place were largely around fuel prices being more expensive in Kenya as compared to our neighbors whose fuel actually passed through Kenya. I now sort of understand that based off all these taxes that are levied, and I actually considered when doing the fuel price calculations, of course it would be higher. But just for Fiona to go back to her blog and also just elaborate a bit more on that, so that we get to understand this argument Kenyans are making, how valid is it? So yeah, I think that's just about it for now. Thanks, guys.
I think we can take those. Is there, Vivian, do you want to also take that? You can attempt. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. Before Fiona comes in, or even Kwame, I can attempt the first question by, I believe it's Simiyu. So concerning the Dangote in Mombasa. So this proposed refinery, it is proposed to be a shared facility between East African countries. And we know it is spearheaded by someone called Aliko Dangote, and they're proposing to construct it in Mombasa. From the analysis or from the statistics that is available, it shows that it will by building this massive, it will generate close to 650,000 barrels of fuel of oil per day. And we have noticed from the presentation when Kwame commented, he said that Kenya, we are consuming close to 100,000. So this implies that if this facility works efficiently to the maximum capacity that is proposed here, then it means that almost 550 barrels per liter will need to be exported to other countries. So this can be a good idea, because now basically the facility will be shared. It is not, the costs are not incurred by Kenya alone, because the proposed cost of constructing it alone, remember we saw that refineries, they are capital intensive. So to construct them, it requires a huge amount of capital. And for this refinery, the proposed cost is 16 to 20 billion USD. That is about 2.1 or 2.6 trillion Kenya shillings. So it is a high cost. So because it will be shared, it is a facility that will be shared between East African countries. So the cost will be shared. That can make sense to some extent. Then also, so the investment, if it works efficiently, so that is the point I'm repeating, if it works efficiently, then it is, and the exportation works well, then fundamentally it will change the Kenya's energy dependence and the industrial status and also the physical health. Only on that condition if it works efficiently. So maybe someone can add on that, even as I invite Fiona as well.
Maybe I can answer the others, the ones by Winnie, and then Kwame can add on the refinery. So her first question was on whether if at the IEA we were to calculate the prices of fuel, we would arrive at the same prices as EPRA. Now, I would answer yes and no. I would answer no because, in fact, I think both answers would be the same. The explanation would be the same. You see, when you look at the figures that are released by EPRA every 14th, they just give us a consolidated number. So for landed cost, remember we've had a conversation for like 12 or so different small costs that go into it. Yeah, I think in fact that's the main component. Storage and distribution as well have a few. Now, EPRA does not publish all of these 20 plus costs for us to know. And so I think probably what we need to ask for as one of the recommendations, because this pricing model was supposed to be transparent, is for them to be able to provide all of those small costs. So that if I want to know how much demurrage, dumerage charges were charged for this particular consignment, I can be able to know. We also don't know the conversion rates that they use. So we normally just estimate, right? So this is how many kgs make a liter of diesel or super petrol, for instance. Because remember, the crude oil is usually bought in metric tons. So, and then that is converted to liters. So I think if they give us all of these components, we love data so much at the IEA. We can be able to do it, and we can do it even before, by the time they're releasing, we're also releasing our prices, so that maybe the difference is just a few cents. But unfortunately for now, we cannot be able to do that. What we can be able to work with is what they have provided for us. So I hope that answers your first question. And you see, that's why it's even hard to answer and say that yes, there are hidden costs or there are no hidden costs, because even with this G2G deal, we don't know what other components probably that they add along the way. And then in terms of your second question on whether the conversation that Kenyans were having by comparing fuel prices in the neighboring countries and Kenya is a valid argument, I would say yes. I think what most people were doing is that they were just simply converting everything into Kenyan shillings, and then doing a price comparison, right? That can be a bit misleading, because the tax regime for petroleum products in Kenya and in Uganda or Tanzania is slightly different. So in that conversation, so yes, it was saying part of the conversation, but it was not fully telling us the entire story, okay? Because you have even, like you see, for us, when you're comparing the price and you're comparing maybe the price of kerosene, which at the pump is 190, but then there's a true price, which is about 245, because government is, okay, or citizens paid the 55 earlier, and then now they're paying the 190. So there's that. So what exactly are you comparing? The second thing that I would like us to think about, because we are teachers and it would be unfair for you to go to bed without learning this simple, this good principle, is that there's something that we call time price, okay? So this is just the amount of time that a person must work to be able to afford a particular product or service, okay? And it's usually a good concept because the same 1 hour that I have in Kenya is the same 1 hour that a Ugandan has, okay? And it's good because it ends up reflecting the true cost of a good or service, all right? Because people just don't pay things with money, they pay with their time. Because now even if I go, I carry out a particular task, I'm paid, that money, the time that I have taken is what has earned me that particular money, okay? So that we don't just focus on the nominal. And this is why I want to bring this conversation. So I want us to go to Uganda and look at their minimum wage. It is 130,000 UGX, okay? In Kenya, it is about 16,113. And I know it could be lower. I know that there are people who are paid lower, but let's just work with the minimum wage in these countries. In Tanzania, it's 80,000 Tanzanian shillings, okay? So if you were to take the price of fuel in these three countries, in Uganda, the price of a liter of fuel is 5,244. Please, it is Ugandan shillings, not Kenyan shillings. In Kenya, it's 214. In Tanzania, it's 4,115, okay? Now, a Ugandan citizen takes 6 hours of his day, 6 hours. So meaning if he started working at 8 a.m., wow, ni jioni, we are tired. By what time? By around 3 is when he can afford a liter of fuel, 6 hours, okay? Based on their minimum wage and the price of a liter of fuel in their country. A Kenyan takes 2 hours to be able to afford that liter of fuel if you're being paid 16,000. A Tanzanian takes 8 hours, meaning he has worked the entire day to be able to afford a liter of fuel. Now, of course, when we do those conversions that we were doing, definitely we will say that fuel is cheaper in Uganda. Again, there's all the tax component and all of that. For me, as a Kenyan, if I was to move across the border, buy that fuel, it's very affordable based relative to my income. But the Ugandan who is across the border would probably not fully agree with me because he'll be like, look, Fiona, I have to work 6 hours. You're working 2 hours. So even as we're having that conversation, yes, you are not wrong to have it like that. That is one way of thinking about it. But I want you to also think about the price of fuel relative to the incomes of all of these citizens, okay? Then it brings the entire conversation home. Otherwise, then, and I'm hoping that now, it's unfortunate I can't see all your names, but I'm hoping by now, when we uko kwa mtandao, when people are having that conversation, that the students of economics here can now have it a bit differently. I hope, Winnie, that answers your question. Thank you.
Well, let me chime in on the question of, Emmanuel, I hope that's okay. Let me chime in on the question of the refinery, and let me make sure I read that question correctly so I can answer it. And the question is basically, what does it mean that, what does it mean? What does the Dangote investment in Kenya mean to the, yes, first, I need to apologize. Yes, I referred to Honorable Karoli Omondi as a MP for Gwasi. That's not true. We have to be, yes, he's the MP for Suba South. So thanks for that correction. Thanks for that correction, Emmanuel, and I stand corrected. But the point is, the question you're asking is, what does the Dangote investment in Kenya mean to Kenya's economy, the fuel sector, and the pricing? So let's start with this one. The proposal by that was made, and of course the president has echoed it as well, is Mr. Aliko Dangote, or the company that he owns, has made a big investment in a refinery in West Africa, not specifically Nigeria. And is starting to refine with the possibility that refining crude oil from the Nigerian from Nigeria would then allow for exports. And that possibility is there. And I think some of the experts have gone, have seen references that it actually was even sent to some countries in Europe. That's all good. There is no, because this is private investments, if this enterprise was to establish a private investment in Kenya, I think that would be all good. Why? Because the risk is actually borne by a private sector person. But there's a rub, there's a risk. One of the things that happens with big investors, and this particular gentleman we're speaking about is very good at it, is extracting concessions from government that limit competition. So for instance, there's a big debate in Nigeria and a controversy about whether that infrastructure investment, large as it is, should allow for one firm to enjoy monopoly rights and have exclusive access to government petroleum without, obviously, that access being made available to others, but more importantly, to prevent the import of competing refined petroleum products into Nigeria. That's a dangerous and creepy slide. So that's one. So if the concession is for somebody to come and make that as an FDI investment without locking government to one specific price controls or deterring the competition that could come from imported refined fuels, then it's something we must look at very, very cautiously. That would not be an investment, that would be a political an instrument, right? Used for monopoly purposes. So we have to be careful about that. The second point is, let's remember that the government of Kenya had a refinery established sometime in the mid-60s, but which was closed down. One of the brilliant things that President Kibaki did in the year 2004 or 2005, it had been operating for a long time. It was completely inefficient, and with a liberalized sector, government allowed for imports of what we call white products, which were already imported products. So Vivian explained that refineries have a certain economic character. They tend to be low margin and high volume. So the margins are very low. Refining oil, petroleum margins for countries that, I mean, for people who import, is something like $2 per barrel. So you don't have a lot of, and that's for the barrel, not for the liter, a barrel. So it's value addition, and it requires very heavy refining. They call it cracking technology. It requires very heavy refining, or rather huge volumes, so that you make money off a bigger number. So what that means is that if this investment was to be made, and I think the discussion that has been had is that it would consolidate the demand in the eastern seaboard. So Tanzania, Uganda, perhaps South Sudan and all that, and they do that refining here, then it is possibly going to be useful. But that does not mean that government should foreclose. As we've seen debates in West Africa suggest, those who would want to actually have competitive pressure by importing already refined products, because there's all places in the globe where refined products are. So anybody who wishes to foreclose the Kenyan market to themselves and the refining plant, I think that we need to be very, very careful about. But regardless of that, yes. So that's one. The second one that my colleagues have mentioned is, you can see that a great part of Kenya's petroleum price is government take. Government takes a bigger amount than the people who transport, the people who do in terms of revenues. And that has created dependence in the public sector and the fiscal policy. And that's why it's very difficult to unwind. But you still say that if you do conversion for conversion, petroleum in Kenya is still one of the most expensive, not only for Kenya's income level, but outside Europe, Kenya has some of the most expensive petroleum based on a conversion by conversion, specific conversion basis. Thanks.
This is to Kwame. On the simulation that he did, because it's a very important concept that a lot of Kenyans need to understand. So my question, or rather suggestion, would be, is it possible for us to have a separate conversation on it? Because I think for me, as Winnie, I don't know if anybody else is of the same opinion. I think that was a very, very important part of the conversation that has not really been had in relation to fuel consumption in Kenya. That is also very, very important and critical, even as we dissect this whole fuel price saga that is going on. So would it be something that would be considered to just have it separately, as a separate conversation, maybe, Kwame?
Yes, I mean, maybe we should do a masterclass in which anybody wants to join to understand this. For those of you who are here and you're members of the IEA, we could invite you into the IEA and go take you through the numbers and the interpretation of the results. We are interested in that. And if you become a member, then that would be useful. But yes, that question is very, very important because people assume that a shock of this kind, we have food shocks every year. And one of the things that happens when a food shock happens, or rather when a shock happens even for food prices, is basically the best economics reasoning says you don't place a permanent subsidy. You subsidize the most affected based on their income level or other vulnerability, and you subsidize or you fund across the shock. Because government intervention itself has other implications or has other consequences for the market. So if it's a shock, then it should be actually funding across the shock by its own. So yes, we can have a conversation on the three things, which is basically what is the best option. An SPR based on the numbers that we have, Strategic Petroleum Reserve doesn't seem it's leaning against, the numbers lean against it. That's one, based on, and it would be failing on its own merits, right? Because we saw the numbers. The second point would probably be either it would have to be scaled down, allow the private sector to establish it, and to consider whatever other options are. And the options are there, hedging or another insurance policy based on the best economic outcomes. So yes, in short, I was just overstating it, but yes, we should have that conversation separately, including the conversation on the economics of a refinery and whether it would be the right place to place it, because it has serious economic, not only consequences, but the environmental consequences. I'm not too sure if Kenyans have adequately priced that in. Thanks.
Okay, Vivian, can I invite you to make your concluding remarks and then followed by Kwame and then Fiona?
Okay, thank you very much. What I'm taking home is that the key question is not basically how to make fuel cheapest today, because I know all of us, when we talk about prices, we really want the prices to be cheaper and affordable. But the key question is not how to make fuel prices cheaper today, but how to create petroleum pricing framework that is efficient. Fiona's talked about transparency and also competitive and sustainable in the future. So we have suggested the reforms that will be able to lower the unnecessary cost and also preserve critical infrastructure. So thank you very much for joining and also for contributing. We are looking forward to seeing you again in the next webinar.
Yes.
Thank you.
Three things that I've learned. First, let's understand that Kenya still has a pre-industrial structure of energy, and petroleum is important. It's a modern energy source. More use of it is probably consistent with our faster economic growth, but let's not forget that the energy policy needs to be a little bit more than just petroleum and crude pricing. So that's the first. The second one is the strategic petroleum reserve is a good thing to consider, but let's consider it based on what risk it is trying to solve. And thirdly, we need to consider for Kenya's energy safety the fact that the pricing mechanism, which is a price control mechanism, and the monthly setting is redundant. This crisis has proved that it is not useful. The Petroleum Development Levy as well has run out of money very, very quickly, just as it was needed. So it is clear that a mechanism that allows for fuel prices to find the right prices, to find the right levels through competition would be the superior one. But because government chooses to ensure that energy security is useful, or rather, energy security read as stability of prices is useful, we need to consider the opportunity costs. And in my view, given the growth demand, the fiscal position of the government of Kenya, and the opportunity costs in terms of other social services, the number of doctors we train, the number of teachers, and the number of kids we put in school, I think communicated properly, this is not the right, trying to resolve the problems through a strategic petroleum reserve is not the most efficient decision. Thank you.
For me, it's just to build on the recommendation that we've given on compressing all the levies and taxes into one major tax. So it's just to implore the government to be able to do a comprehensive fiscal impact assessment on it, So to check the potential effects on government revenue, fuel prices, whether it's inflation, household welfare, and overall just to look at how it will affect economic activity. And yeah, and so that they can be able to see how that would work out, because I know as well they carry out significant evidence-based analysis in some things from time to time. Yeah, and that would be my concluding remarks.
Thank you so much for joining